Challans, CEO and co-founder of Quantum Insider, who is going to be moderating the next discussion, which is on, we mentioned this earlier, is there money to be made from quantum right now, even before we have working fault-tolerant machines and so on? Who will profit, if so, from selling shovels or possibly lasers to the miners before they find the gold? So over to you, Alex. And if you could, where are your panelists? Oh, they're all right, ready to go. Brilliant. Having microphones still stuck on. I think they're ready to go. So please welcome Alex Challans and his panelists. There you are. Thank you.
Well, you're all going to be glad that I'm not going to sing. I can't sing. Sorry, Chris, I can't compete with you. And thanks to all of you for staying for a little bit later in the day. I appreciate it. Today, as discussed, we're going to be talking about whether there's money to be made in the quantum technology industry. Now, this is a very sensitive topic. We've heard a lot of effusive statements today. There's been a lot of excitement, and we're talking about huge addressable markets. But there's also, as we just learned now, the risk of what's been called a quantum winter. So I've already had a preview last week with the speakers here, so I'm incredibly excited to dig into this topic. So I'm joined first by Dekel Persi, who is a partner at TPY Capital, an early-stage venture fund in Israel. Then Jason Pontin, a partner at DCVC, a San Francisco-based venture fund. And then last but not least, Paul Dabbar, who is the CEO of Bohr Quantum, a company developing a commercial quantum networking system. He was previously the Undersecretary for Science of the US Department of Energy. And I'm going to start with you, Paul. So as the co-author of the US National Quantum Initiative, I'm really interested to see how your perception on this market as a revenue-generating market has changed or stayed the same since then.
Yeah, so when we launched a very large initiative in the United States, which was really modeled on the UK, for the people here who did that, we very much looked at that and it's made it bigger because America has more money. This is bigger. There's some value to scale in terms of budget. That initial effort and the quantum internet blueprint was about building plans and building community, right? We made certain that the 5 R&D centers across the United States had contributions and participants from universities, labs, and the private sector. That was the first time the private sector was actually included in early stage technology. And so what's next about revenues that I think is certainly a possibility is that there's some material government revenues that could come out first. We've certainly been talking about like BT and Toshiba on the networking side, and I think that there's certainly potential revenues from QKD. But from the U.S. perspective, there's a bill about to get passed in which there's going to be 2 very large procurements, as I call it, revenues, from the U.S. government. One will be the largest quantum cloud purchase in the sector. That'll be $340 million that they will bid out. Right now, they do $4 million as kind of a starter version of that. And so they're going to allow quantum computer companies, I don't know if people here are going to want to bid into that. There'll be multiple winners, not just like one cloud provider. So that's $340 million of QC revenues, and then that capacity will be granted out to researchers to use. So it will broaden the use case in the community. The second one is $500 million construction for the first quantum internet that networks quantum data, not quantum key, but actual quantum data, networking quantum computers, networking sensors. So the combination of those two from the United States of $840 million of revenues over the next few years is certainly a prospect in the revenue space.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's a debate I had earlier, which is how can you classify government as revenue? And yes. I think, yes, you can from a financial statement perspective, but I'd love to get your perspective on this, Jason. You've invested in a couple of quantum companies. How do you think about revenue in the space?
Well, thank you, Alex. I would say that a market pool created by governments wanting to do their own research or funding more research isn't yet an industry. So just to give my bona fides, DCVC was a seed investor in D-Wave. It was the first investor into Rigetti. We invested in Q-Control, the quantum sensing company. And I, for my pains, actually invested in Menton.ai, which is designing novel peptides or proteins using D-Wave's annealing computers. And I just don't think the space yet is actually, to date, solving real commercial problems for businesses. I think everyone in this room believes it will do, and there are a large number of problems that I at least have dedicated the last portion of my career to solving, which might only be plausibly be solved with quantum computers. But that old joke about fusion, the technology of the future, and always will be, that's not quite true for quantum, but it does always seem to be that 5 to 7 years over the horizon. And if there's a quote for this, is at least DCVC, at the moment, in terms of looking for commercial investments in the space, continues to invest in the hardware, the fundamental machines, all the applications. We haven't recently found a true application company that we like.
Very interesting to hear from an investor, a very honest perspective around where we are.
We have
today.
a 5 to 7 year perspective, which is quite a long time in reality. Everyone says they do 5 to 7, but it's really less. And we can continue to re-up in a company for maybe 10 years. So we have this transactional timeline, a horizon of 10 years. And it's really hard to get us to conviction that there will be commercial applications the next decade.
And I want to move on to Dekel. How do you get your head around, as an investor in this space, how do you get your head around this uncertainty on timeline? When you're talking about a 7-year horizon and maybe 10 if you're being really generous, how do you get your head around it?
Maybe just to put some numbers in perspective, because we've heard throughout the day a lot about the hype and inflated expectations, but this is still a very, very small industry. I mean, just to put some benchmarks, we have been praised for the VC community invested $2 billion in quantum computing in the last 2 years, that it's 10 times the number in the past decade, okay? That's 1/3% from the total VC investments globally. It's a drop in the ocean. And then if you're looking at the government side, you mentioned government, $30 billion government funding plans. That's not for 1 year, like for multiple years. That's about 10% of what it costs to take Apollo to the moon, okay? Where the big money is not there yet. So as a venture capital, first you have to set your expectations. This is maybe not about making a unicorn from zero to the decacorn in 2 years. So that's really a long-term play. In terms of risk, so yeah, there's a lot of risk associated with any technology. Specifically in quantum, there's obviously the duration risk, how long this is going to take. We as a fund are actually trying to take an agnostic approach to duration and actually to target those companies that tend to benefit from a longer duration. If you find a company that can solve a problem for whether it's a government-sponsored program or whether it's a big tech program, they can solve a problem and they can bring the company from $10 million valuation to $500 million valuation. I've done my part as a venture. Second, in venture, we look at the upside, but we also look at the downside. And the previous panelists talked about the scarcity of talent. That's a downside protection in VC, because if you are building a very good team, even if you are not hitting revenue, but you have some product achievements, some product milestones, you have created a value and expertise that might be valuable for. That's not what we aim for in terms of exit as a VC, but that's a downside protection. And maybe last point, which is something that's not much spoken about, is the geopolitical risk. And we're seeing it, especially in the recent months, when we're witnessing in the other side of Europe. And this goes both ways. So on one hand, if you're an investor and you're invested in a quantum hardware company, you know that your market might be limited, restricted, both in terms of clients and in terms of access to follow-on capital. And the other side of it is that if you're a scientist, rest assured that as long as this arms race is continuing, there's going to be government funding, and hopefully we'll get to the order of magnitude of the Apollo or the NASA annual budget, which is, again, 10 times more than global quantum spend.
That's a great answer. And Jason, where do you think, if you kind of map out a quantum computer stack today, you've obviously got things going down to the wires, you've got the fridges, you've got the control systems, etc. It's a bit of a debate is where is the value in that market going to go? Who is going to benefit? Is it people solving error correction? Is it the QPU providers? How do you think about that as an investor?
Oh, that's relatively easy. To me, the most interesting problem in the space at the moment is error correction. We will soon be generating from some of the vendors who have been speaking here today, thousands or millions of qubits, but they're not usable qubits. They're not functional qubits. So the problems that I work on as an investor, modeling proteins, designing new OLEDs, doing quantum chemistry, those things need truly functional qubits. So we are looking at a number of companies in the error correction space today. I think that is the most exciting space in investment at the moment. And just to say a word about the coming of winter, I wouldn't be so pessimistic. If we really focus on the milestones that need to be achieved in terms of beginning to generate qubits and then doing error correction, the milestones are fairly well defined. And as error correction begins to produce more functional qubits, different types of applications do begin to fall into space. Carmen mentioned one on the last panel. You can begin to do some real interesting things in quantum sensing once you can begin to network quantum sensors. Paul's work in quantum communications also clicks into space. And then sometime, again, 7 to 10 years out, the really interesting things around quantum chemistry become plausible as well.
And I'd like to dig into that a bit more, Paul. So, obviously we focus so much on quantum computing. It's the exciting industry, and it's, everyone almost accidentally says it and forgets about the other two obvious ones. Now, how do you think about the opportunities in let's call it the other parts of quantum technology?
Yeah, so I just want to hit on something that Jason said that I am very strongly in support of. The first applications around quantum computational biology, computational chemistry is almost certainly going to be the first major use cases. I'll give a quick example of a non-quantum HPC, which is in the big scheme of things quite similar. When we built the top 2 supercomputers in the world, Summit and Sierra, with our friends from IBM and Jay and team, when COVID hit, in 3 weeks' time, running on Summit, which is a combined GPU, CPU machine, the top-end supercomputer at the time, we were able to narrow down looking at SARS and MERS and small molecules that was used for that and the similarities to the COVID-2, COVID-19 virus. In 3 weeks, we were able to pick out the top 10 likely vaccines. And then that fed right into the US government's purchase of those 10 vaccines, which was called BARDA, which was the entity that just funded all of it and then declared victory right in 9 months. And the earliest, the previous vaccine race was 3 years. That's a really specific example. Because everyone's talking about computational biology and so on, giving you a concrete example, 3 weeks is when they were able to narrow down to 10 vaccines and able to narrow down the trials that people have been talking about and have a much higher probability. So I did want to kind of comment to that. I'm a big believer in that, and there's going to be more complicated things than COVID-19 coming forward. So on your question about about the other use cases, clearly networking. We're seeing BT and Toshiba. We're seeing EU effort on quantum key distribution. I think that has a very good likelihood of there being commercial customers picking up on that. clearly sensing. The big sensing one that I personally like is biology. Someday we're going to be able to use a quantum MRI machine to be able to map every individual cell in your body. And if you stop and you think about that for a quick second, you can follow an individual cancer cell leaving your thyroid and going going to your pancreas, rather than waiting for it to metastasize for a current MRI. The medical impact of that, what I just said, is stunning. Okay, but too long to get into here today. The amount of data that you're going to collect in that medical imaging is massive, and you're going to need a quantum computer to analyze that sensing data. And back to what I'm working on today, which is you're going to need to move that data. You're going to be able to network that data from that quantum MRI machine to a quantum computer to be able to actually process that volume.
It's interesting when you look at the market, there's all these opportunities for revenue perhaps that are not necessarily seen. So data is one that I hadn't really thought of until you brought it up with me. But of course, when you look across the stack, there's also all sorts of ways of generating revenue. We've met companies who are providing hardware, supplying the quantum computing companies. And it's an open question, so jump in. Where do you think there's like interesting opportunities in that regard? And should we be focusing on that more whilst we're waiting for that indeterminate time horizon?
Maybe I'll take that. I think the number of opportunities is equal to the number of problems.
Yes.
And we're not short of problems in quantum technology. I think both in the software stack, I mean, all the way from very close to the qubits, all the way up to the application layer, there are problems that needs to be solved. We've heard the long list of problems throughout the day, so I'm not going to repeat, but each one of these problems is a revenue opportunity. And again, not to mention the hardware, where we are in a situation where you have a race with multiple players, betting on different architectures, different engineering approach. I don't think they will be able to pull it off themselves. I mean, with all respect to the big tech companies, historically, innovation has come from startup companies collaborating with big tech, with the community. So I think there's a lot of room for revenues.
Oh, that's great. And what I'd be interested to see is, we talked about this uncertain time horizon, but I'm going to put you on the spot. And I'm going to put you on the spot, Jason.
Yes,
So,
thank you.
what I'd like to have a sense for is, are we able today to have a look, let's put some assumptions around this, on, 5 years we hit some kind of useful revenue, 10 years you hit some other type of useful revenue. How can we characterize that today?
I feel on the spot, and I feel unable to go and predict. I think within 4 years we will be able to do meaningful error correction for a category of problems in, say, computational biology that are meaningful. So within 4 to 7 years, I will be able to do things like design the orbitals of a covalent warhead for a covalent drug. So not modeling a whole protein, but doing useful things that would improve the speed and the efficiency and the efficacy of drug development. And I think you'll be able to do similar experiments in industrial chemistry, and that will provide some other applications as well. If you ask me for more general purpose applications, of which we've heard that all day, I can't tell you. But specific high-level problems on the early foothills of quantum chemistry within 4 to 7 years.
No, I appreciate I've put you on the spot there. So I'll move on to digging into a little bit more around the chemistry piece, because it reveals something that hasn't been discussed so much today, which is around profit. Yeah. Now, this market, we see all these big headlines of total addressable market, and they're very seductive, but who's going to get that? So if you take a chemical company, we've heard a lot about chemical companies. If you're building some new drugs or you're coming up with some very interesting new innovations, which of your portfolio companies or which of the companies that you found are going to be the ones who get those spores? Is it the chemical company or is it the startup?
Yeah, so there's an interesting kind of group, Jason would probably know about them better, but there's a group of UK companies that are really digging into not just quantum, but general
Yes.
Computational biology, computational chemistry, to narrow down the trials I just described in the COVID-19 case, and actually trying to make that a business model. If you actually look at the chemical companies and the traditional bio companies and even the traditional bioscience areas like the NIH, they were not very excited about computational biology. I can tell you we had to kind of advocate for high performance computing capabilities, and they didn't want to like move off of their traditional trial process. And so, I think there's a decent chance a lot of the startups who don't have that institutional kind of challenge, and they could deliver faster discovery of drugs. And believe me, if you're going to come up with a beyond lithium-ion battery chemistry that could come up, that could outperform lithium-ion by 3 to 5 times. Okay, and by the way, what I just said is completely doable, depending on the metric. I don't want to get too much into chemistry, but lithium-ion took about 11 years in the lab. We think that we can narrow it down to about 3 years. So if you think about it from an investment point of view, if you have a 8-year jump on the next battery chemistry because you're able to get to trials faster because of computational chemistry, people can do their net present value of 8 years of and a market mover, which is almost hard to
if you have the hardware
If you have the hardware.
and you don't have the hardware. So at the present time, at the short term, startups that are making money are basically following the cybersecurity business model. It's return on fear. If you are a chemical company or a pharma company, you don't want to be the second or the third to be in the game. So you invest now in talent and in tools and everything. So if and when the revolution comes upon us, you will be ready. I think there's no doubt that in the long run, when we get to the stage of fault tolerant quantum advantage, those are the players, the farmers and the chemicals and the energy that will capture most of the value. Ultimately, they are the end users, and they are the ones who are building real life molecules or whatever it is.
I mean, Alex, let me be a more conventional VC for a moment and be a hyperbolist and paint a picture of the future, though. The world is going to be very interesting. We have no idea what it's going to look like. Almost all of chemical space has never been mapped. For the last 100 years, like barbarians, we've been bolting the same basic 7 pieces together, largely from cracking hydrocarbons and expecting to find real innovation. And in the area where I do a lot of investment, in biotech, we're nowhere. 97% of new drugs fail. And we keep on asking why, and because we're apes playing with these very simple tools. What you want to be able to do is to rationally design molecules in silico or whatever substrate we eventually end up using for quantum computing, and then test them in real time, creating molecules that we know will do what we expect them to do. Now, we're a long way from that, but the question that you asked is absolutely fascinating, is who owns the value for that? And we don't know. At the moment, we have these biotech companies who, if we're honest, are in the space of generating more or less novel biological or chemical insights, who then sell their insights onto large biopharma companies. And we've got a chemical industrial industry dominated by a vanishingly small number of petrochemical companies. What the world looks like when this capability is widely available is unknown and really interesting. I'll tell you one thing, though, which I'm fairly convinced of. It's not going to be a free resource. Before I joined DCVC and they offered me a job, I tried to raise my own mid-sized fund to explore this area of quantum chemistry. And Craig Mundy, who ran research at Microsoft, said, Jason, if you're going to be generating billion-dollar molecules on my machine, why do you think I'm going to go and give you that machine for nearly free? So what I suspect...
Because you can't do it yourself.
Because we can't do it
You can't
ourselves.
yourself. You need them to...
So what I suspect is going to happen is that the big hardware vendors who provide this service in the cloud are going to be taking equity positions of some sort in the capacity which they are loaning people like me and the people I work with to generate solutions. So it's good. We are 10 years away from one of those economic fracturings of the world which we thought we understood, based around a few large economic actors. And I think that all that's going to change relatively soon.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you one example to Jason's to his broad BC speech.
Yeah,
which is so. Let's say in quantum networking, we're able to do picosecond synchronization, right? Just relatively, kind of you hear this from NIST all the time and so on. So if you're able to sync up machines at about 1,000 times faster than the current systems that are out there, where can you make revenue? And should the startup have an equity piece in the business model of the application versus just selling a product, right? So I gave a very specific quantum example to the very good general point that Jason just mentioned.
It's interesting, someone from the audience has asked, maybe the whole approach to IP will change and therefore value distribution will change. And it's interesting, we started with a simple question, where's money going to be made? We've ended up with a fracturing of the economy. So is that what we're talking about here? Because we really don't know what these business models will look like. Is that something that we could expect in the next 10, 15 years, that is a profound change to our economy?
I think there will be a profound change. I mean, Arthur C. Clarke used to say that any truly novel technology looks like magic to people who haven't encountered it before. But also these great technological changes in society, like the petrochemical revolution, produce new civilizations with new economic arrangements, new groups of rentiers and capitalists, and we work for different companies. So I guess for everyone in the room, I don't actually think it's too early to begin thinking about the part that you want to play in that future, even if we have, 5 to 7 years of important milestones at a technical engineering level we still have to work through.
I mean, I'll give a Star Trek example, but it's actually really happening, which is there was a company spun out of my old organization, which they're now converting non-emitting power, so it could be nuclear or wind or solar, into clothing. Okay, it's the exact opposite of how normally someone thinks about Einstein. Okay, instead of taking matter and turning it into energy, you could through a chemistry string, right, take renewable power, a carbon string, make hydrogen, make polyester, and they're actually putting content into athletic gear right now, so that the polyester you can wear like in this vest. It's about 10% of this vest is the material value. Right now, that chemistry string I just described is about 100% more expensive than current petrochemicals. But the plan is for this particular company to take that chemistry string and to squeeze it with the sort of things that the sort of things that quantum computing can help design. And we may reach a time frame of the replicator, at least when it comes to ethylene and polyester and products. And by the way, what I just described is negative carbon, right? What I just described is you have negative carbon clothing. And so that's like a really specific example, right, of a chemistry problem that we continue to squeeze with better knowledge around quantum computing about how to engineer, once again, as Jason described. That's a different world, right? Yeah. When we can take fusion, I'm going to go my fusion route. Fusion, yeah. I'm not way out on the edge. Fusion, and turn it into clothing.
Well, I mean, that's fantastic. I mean, if I could try and wrap up from what I've learned today, effectively we're saying that, well, we don't know exactly how much revenue there'll be. The world could profoundly change, and business models could profoundly change. And what an exciting conclusion to our talk. So thank you, everyone, for listening today, and thank you to our fantastic speakers. Please give them a round of applause.
Thank you.